The Gentleman Killer, A Tale of Deception, T.S. BBC radio drama. On a warm evening in Flaxborough, the sort that coaxed even the most reclusive residents into the open air, the annual summer civic banquet was drawing to its leisurely close. The affair had been conducted, as always, in the Borough Hall's faded ballroom, a space whose gilt mouldings and municipal portraits lent the proceedings a peculiar dignity, like a faded dowager determined to keep up appearances. A quartet of amateur musicians, arranged in one corner beneath a drooping municipal banner, were engaged in a slow waltz. Aldermen and councillors drifted between tables, fortified by lukewarm claret and the heady sense of civic self-importance. The event, being primarily an exercise in mutual congratulation, was proceeding much as it always had, comfortably predictable, faintly tedious, and entirely safe until, of course, it wasn't. The disturbance was at first no more than a minor ripple, the kind of thing likely to be mistaken for an overindulgence in trifle. A chair scraped sharply back near the high table, followed by a short, strangled sound. Several heads turned, eyebrows raised in polite inquiry. Mr. Lawrence Penbury, a gentleman of no small local consequence, had been seen to rise halfway from his seat, clutch his throat, and then crumple unceremoniously to the parquet floor. His wife let out a cry of such practiced hysteria that several guests wondered if she had been rehearsing. Mayor Carter, who had been mid-sentence in a speech of singular length and opacity, was rather affronted at the interruption. "Good heavens," he muttered irritably, before shuffling towards the fallen figure with an air of civic duty reluctantly assumed. A circle of well-fed faces soon gathered, forming a barrier of anxious whispers and conflicting advice. "Fetch water!" cried someone.
"No brandy,"
insisted another. "Shouldn't we loosen his collar?"
"Not in mixed company."
It was Mrs. Hardstaff, formidable head of the Ladies' Guild, who finally provided a decisive note. "Send for Dr. Hilliard at once," she commanded, and her tone brooked no delay. By the time Dr. Hilliard arrived, a stout man in shirt-sleeves who looked as if he had been interrupted mid-pudding, Penbury was quite still. The doctor knelt, muttered, prodded, and at last looked up with a grim set to his mouth. "I'm afraid," he announced, "that Mr. Penbury is quite dead." The words spread outward like ripples from a stone.
"Dead?" It was hardly the sort of thing one expected at a civic banquet.
Someone suggested, in a tone that hoped to be reassuring, that it must have been his heart. Another proposed a stroke, but Mrs. Penbury, dabbing theatrically at her eyes with a handkerchief, declared otherwise. "He was in perfect health this very morning," she wailed, as though a well-functioning digestive tract were proof against mortality itself.
"There must be—"
"Some dreadful mistake," Dr. Hilliard, who disliked being contradicted, sniffed.
"There's no mistake, madam."
"The man is dead." At that moment a uniformed constable appeared, having been summoned by an anxious young clerk. He took in the scene with a solemnity that verged on excitement, then cleared his throat. "If you please," he said, "Inspector Perbrite is on his way." This announcement caused a further stirring among the guests. Inspector Perbrite was known in Flaxborough as a figure of unfailing courtesy and unnerving persistence. The knowledge that he was coming lent the affair a new gravity, like the sudden appearance of a clergyman at a rather raucous picnic. When Perbrite arrived, he moved with a calmness that contrasted with the fluttering agitation around him. His expression was one of mild sympathy, as though death at a civic function were regrettable but hardly unprecedented. After a brief word with Dr. Hilliard, he straightened and surveyed the gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said quietly, "I must ask you all to remain here for a few moments. It appears that Mr. Penbury's passing is not entirely
natural." A small gasp escaped Mrs. Hardstaff, while Mrs. Penbury's sobs increased by a well-judged degree.
The others merely exchanged looks, their minds racing with speculation.
"Not natural."
It was a phrase that admitted of possibilities too delicate to voice in public. Perbrite bent again over the body, noting with interest the overturned wine glass beside it. A dark stain spread across the linen like an ink blot, suggestive of mischance or intent. Behind him, voices murmured, "Poison?"
Surely not. Who would dare?
The inspector neither confirmed nor denied. Instead, he addressed the room once more. "Until we know more, I would be grateful if you could cast your minds back over the evening. Anything out of the ordinary, no matter how trivial, may be of importance." The guests nodded solemnly, each already considering which details to share and which to keep safely tucked away. For in Flaxborough the truth was rarely a matter of simple fact. It was, like the town itself, shaped by appearances, proprieties, and the quietly desperate need to be thought respectable. As Perbrite straightened and signalled for the constable to clear a space, he allowed himself a single inward thought. This would not be a simple case of misadventure, not with a man like Lawrence Penbury, and certainly not in Flaxborough. By the following morning, news of Lawrence Penbury's sudden demise had spread through Flaxborough with the precision and speed of a well-practiced drill. The official report, relayed by Constable Harold Sims to his sister over a late-night teapot, had been that the gentleman had taken ill during the banquet. By dawn this had evolved into whispers of poison, scandal, and a mysterious stranger seen slipping away into the shadows behind the borough hall. In Flaxborough, where the lives of its inhabitants were often as uneventful as the slow chime of the church clock, nothing stirred excitement quite like the downfall of a man who had been considered both prosperous and respectable. Mrs. Emmeline Hardstaff was first to take up the tale with full dramatic flourish. Over a breakfast of porridge and jam, she informed her companion, a pale, nervous niece visiting from Lincoln, that she had personally witnessed a most peculiar pallor creep over Penbury's features moments before his collapse. "Like wax," she declared, lowering her voice. "A ghastly, sickly wax.
One doesn't see that sort of thing unless there's something in the blood."
Something unnatural. The niece, who had expected nothing more sinister than church services and tepid lemonade during her stay, went pale herself and immediately wrote a long letter home describing the dreadful scene. By mid-morning, the market square was alive with speculation. Grocers abandoned their scales mid-weighing to contribute their theories, and customers lingered with unpurchased vegetables in hand, reluctant to miss any morsel of gossip. The prevailing narrative shifted with each telling. In one version, Penbury had been secretly engaged in dubious business dealings involving imported tobacco. In another, he was said to have kept a mistress in Grimsby, and it was she who had engineered his end. Mr. Pargeter, proprietor of the ironmongers, put forth the notion that Penbury had been on the brink of bankruptcy. "Men like him," Pargeter said, puffing out his chest importantly, "they live beyond their means. When it catches up to them, well, it's either the bottle or the rope." He did not specify how such excess led to collapsing over the dessert course, but the listeners nodded as though he had revealed a deep truth about human nature. In the midst of these public discussions, Inspector Perbrite moved quietly and without fuss. He had spent the early morning hours reviewing the statements collected by Constable Sims and speaking briefly with Dr. Hilliard, whose manner had been prickly and defensive. The doctor was inclined to ascribe Penbury's death to natural causes, perhaps apoplexy brought on by excitement. Yet his description of certain peculiarities when pressed had been hesitant. Perbrite walked through the square as he considered this. He was greeted by respectful nods and occasionally by subtle sidelong glances that betrayed curiosity and unease. People wanted reassurance, but they also wanted drama. The balance was delicate, and he knew better than to tip it too soon. At the entrance of the bakery, he encountered Mrs. Penbury herself, flanked by two sympathetic friends. She was dressed entirely in black, a decision which struck Perbrite as rather efficient, considering her husband had been alive only 12 hours earlier. Her expression was a study in public grief, dignified yet conspicuous. "Inspector," she said, extending a hand that trembled just enough to be noticeable, "I trust you will do everything in your power to discover who is responsible for this monstrous act." "Of course, madam," Perbrite replied smoothly.
At present, we are keeping an open mind. Her lips tightened.
"There is no need for minds to be open, Inspector. My husband was murdered. Of that I am certain."
There are
"Individuals who bore him ill will? Indeed?" Perbrite's tone was politely interested. "Perhaps you could provide me with a few names when you feel ready?" She hesitated, as if weighing the value of disclosure against the advantage of retaining it for later use. Then, with a flutter of her veil, she merely said, "I shall consider it," and swept away. Once she had gone, Perbrite stood for a moment watching her retreating figure. He reflected that public grief and private calculation were seldom mutually exclusive. A sudden commotion at the far end of the square drew his attention. Two young delivery boys were arguing loudly, each insisting he had seen a stranger lurking near the borough hall just before the banquet had ended. Their descriptions were gloriously contradictory. One swore the man had been tall and dark-haired, the other that he had been short and balding. Perbrite separated them with calm good humour, took their statements, and made a mental note that unreliable witnesses were often more revealing than reliable ones. As he left them to their squabble, he encountered Constable Sims emerging from the post office, looking harassed. "Sir," Sims reported, "there's talk now of some letter Mr. Penbury sent yesterday afternoon. Folks are saying it was marked private and urgent. No one knows who it was for." Perbrite murmured.
Interesting.
"We must track that down. Quietly, mind you." As noon approached, the inspector returned briefly to the station, where Sergeant Love was compiling a list of banquet attendees.
There's something odd, sir, Love said, scratching his chin.
A place card went missing from one of the tables.
No one admits to moving it. Perbrite's brow furrowed.
"Curious? Sometimes, Sergeant, the smallest absences tell the loudest tales." Outside, church bells began to toll the hour. The sound mingled with the restless hum of gossip that filled the town like summer flies. Perbrite gazed out the window, considering the fragile web of appearances that held Flaxborough together. Somewhere within it lay the truth about Lawrence Penbury, and the first delicate thread was already beginning to unravel. By evening, the shock of Lawrence Penbury's sudden death had softened into a kind of excited dread, like a storm cloud that refused to disperse. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath, listening for the next peal of thunder. Everywhere, in drawing rooms and parlours, shops and public houses, people were talking, not merely about what had happened, but about why, at Mrs. Briggs' tea rooms, a group of ladies sat huddled around a table, strewn with crumbs and cooling cups, their voices pitched in the low, conspiratorial tones that could nonetheless carry half a street away. Mrs. Hardstaff, as self-appointed guardian of public morals, was at the centre of the discussion. "Well," she declared, lowering her head as though confiding a dreadful secret, "there are those who will tell you it was his heart, but I know better.
Poison, mark my words.
And not the common sort either. Something subtle,
Perhaps slipped into his wine while he was distracted. Miss Blenkinsop,
whose entire social world consisted of an ailing aunt and a pair of rheumatic cats, gasped appreciatively. "But who," she whispered, leaning forward until her bun trembled, "would dare such a thing at a public banquet?"
The audacity of it!
"Someone very bold," said Mrs. Hardstaff darkly, "or very desperate." A pause followed, filled by the clinking of teaspoons. Then another woman, Mrs. Weatherby ventured, "Perhaps it was meant for someone else altogether." This suggestion caused a satisfying shiver of speculation. If true, it opened possibilities deliciously complex. Secret feuds, mistaken identities, enemies lurking under the very noses of respectable folk. By the time the group dispersed, They had constructed a narrative involving illicit love affairs, a disputed inheritance, and at least one foreign assassin. Across town, in the snug of the Sailors' Rest public house, a different set of theories was taking shape, earthier but no less elaborate. The regular patrons gathered round their pints, speaking with the authority of men who considered themselves closer to the realities of life. It was money. "You can be sure of that," declared Jack Roper, a retired docker with a chest like a barrel. Penbury had his fingers in all sorts of schemes. Land deals, property leases, that sort of thing breeds enemies. Someone wanted him out of the way. "Could have been his missus," offered another man with a knowing smirk. "She's a sharp one, that Mrs. Penbury. Don't be fooled by the black veil and sniffles." The others chuckled appreciatively, though a few looked toward the door to make sure no one of consequence had overheard. Meanwhile, Inspector Purbright sat in his office, listening, as Sergeant Love read out notes from the constable's rounds. The day's collection of rumours sounded less like evidence and more like an amateur play performed without a script. "Some folks say he was poisoned by a business rival," Love reported.
Others claim it was an affair gone wrong.
"And there's a tale about a stranger seen buying arsenic at the chemist's, though Mr. Pickles swears he never sold such a thing." Perbrite folded his hands thoughtfully. "Strangers are wonderfully convenient in murder tales, Sergeant. They relieve the locals of unpleasant suspicions." Love looked puzzled. "So you don't believe it was an outsider, sir?" "I believe," said Perbrite gently, "that the human heart has no borders, and envy travels far shorter distances than arsenic." His attention returned to a slim folder lying open on the desk, the preliminary report on Penbury's finances. It revealed nothing illegal, but there were hints of strain: a mortgage extended, a loan repaid unusually quickly. Not enough to prove motive, but enough to suggest disquiet beneath the glossy surface of success. There was also the matter of the missing place card. Love had questioned the serving staff thoroughly, but none could recall who had sat at the vacant spot. "It's a trifling detail," Love had said earlier, but Perbrite was not so sure. Small things often provided the key to larger puzzles. A single absent guest might prove more telling than a room full of witnesses. Late that night, as he walked home through the quiet streets, Perbrite observed how the lighted windows seemed to wink like watchful eyes. Behind each curtain, voices were still murmuring, drawing connections, assigning blame. In a town like Flaxborough, speculation was both sport and survival. People shaped their stories to protect themselves, or to harm others, or simply to feel cleverer than their neighbours. He paused at the corner where the bakers' and greengrocers' shops faced one another. Earlier that day, both establishments had been hives of activity. Now they were shuttered and silent. Yet he could almost hear the ghost of the day's chatter lingering in the air. From the shadows emerged Constable Sims, who had been patrolling nearby. "Evening, sir," Sims said, touching his helmet. "Quiet now, but they're all talking indoors. There's a new rumour. Says Mr. Penbury had written a letter naming someone who threatened him." Perbrite's eyes narrowed slightly.
"And do we know where this letter might be?" "No, sir. Mrs. Penbury claims she hasn't seen it."
"Some say the post office clerk spotted it yesterday, but it never went out." The inspector gave a small, non-committal nod. "Letters, like missing place cards, have a way of turning up when least expected. For now, we let the rumours run their course. They often carry truth along with them, even if it's hidden under layers of embroidery." As he resumed his walk, the night air held a faint, metallic chill. Perbrite reflected that in Flaxborough, truth was seldom shouted from rooftops. It was whispered in corners, shaped by fear, and passed from mouth to mouth until no one could recall the original voice. Somewhere within those whispers lay the clue he needed. He simply had to listen carefully enough to hear it. Inspector Perbrite began the next morning with his usual unhurried routine, though the town around him seemed to be in a state of barely suppressed excitement. Flaxborough had woken early. its streets already humming with the low murmur of speculation. Curtains twitched as he passed, and here and there he caught fragments of hurried conversation cut short when his steady figure appeared in view. At the station, Sergeant Love was waiting with a fresh sheaf of notes and a look of mild bewilderment. "Plenty of talk out there, sir," he reported. "Seems everyone's got a new version of the story. Some folk are saying now that Mr. Penbury was about to expose a scandal in the borough council. Others claim it was something to do with a secret will." Perbrite accepted the papers with a polite nod. "It is remarkable, Sergeant, how a single death can inspire so many tales. I sometimes wonder if they spring from the facts, or if the facts are shaped to fit the tales." Love, who preferred his world arranged in neat cause and effect, said nothing and busied himself with the tea things. Perbrite studied the notes, then set them aside. The time had come for more than hearsay. Quietly, deliberately, he arranged a series of visits to those who had been closest to Lawrence Penbury, or whose actions on the night of the banquet bore closer scrutiny. He preferred to begin with polite conversations rather than confrontations. People revealed far more when they believed themselves merely chatting. His first call was upon Mrs. Penbury, who received him in a drawing-room so lavishly decorated it seemed determined to prove the family's prosperity. She was dressed once again in perfect morning attire, and she greeted him with a graciousness that might have been rehearsed. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head, "I trust you bring news of progress." "Progress," Perbrite replied mildly,
"is often measured in very small steps, madam."
"Today I hope to take a few more of those." She gestured for him to sit and offered tea, which he accepted, noting how smoothly the performance of hospitality concealed her underlying tension. "I understand," he began, "that your husband was in excellent health before the banquet." "Indeed," she said quickly.
"Fit as a man half his age. No hint of illness or distress?"
"None whatsoever." "And yet," Perbrite murmured, stirring his tea, "he seemed troubled in recent weeks. According to others, at least." A flicker crossed her face. Irritation, perhaps, or fear. "My husband was a man of business, Inspector. Business brings cares, naturally. But he was never one to confide in me about such matters." "Quite understandable," said Perbrite soothingly. "Still, I wonder if he mentioned any specific person with whom he had quarrelled." There was a long pause. She sipped her tea, set it down carefully, and replied, "Mr. Penbury was respected by many."
"Admired even."
"Of course, there are always those who resent success. But naming names would be—"
"Unwise," Perbrite inclined his head. "I quite agree."
"Sometimes the mere mention of a name is enough to harm reputations unfairly." He rose a few minutes later, offering condolences so gentle they could not be refused. Once outside, he let the mask slip slightly, his expression settling into thoughtful reserve. Her reluctance had told him almost as much as an outright accusation. From the Penbury residence, he walked to the offices of Alderman Carter, who had been presiding at the banquet when the fatal moment occurred. Carter greeted him with the harassed air of a man juggling civic duty and personal discomfort. "Terrible business, Inspector."
"Absolutely dreadful."
"Penbury was a pillar of this community." "So I gather," Perbrite said. "I should be grateful if you could recount precisely what you observed that evening." Carter launched into a lengthy description, notable mainly for its vagueness. Perbrite listened without interruption, filing away certain inconsistencies. When Carter finished, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, the inspector asked, "And you noticed nothing unusual among the guests? No unfamiliar faces?" "None at all," Carter said firmly. "Every attendee was known to me personally." This answer did not sit comfortably with the matter of the missing place card, but Perbrite made no comment. Instead, he thanked the alderman and departed, leaving Carter looking rather relieved to see him go. His next stop was Dr. Hilliard's surgery. The doctor was in a foul temper, having been besieged by townsfolk demanding reassurance about their own health following rumours of poison. "Between you and me, Inspector," Hilliard grumbled, "half the population now thinks they've been dosed with some rare toxin."
"I've seen perfectly healthy individuals trembling over their pulse rates." Purbright allowed himself the ghost of a smile.
"It does rather demonstrate the power of suggestion." When asked about Penbury's death, Hilliard became more cautious. The symptoms were peculiar, he admitted, but not conclusive. There was no time for a proper examination before the body was removed. "Would you say," Perbrite asked carefully, "that natural causes are still a possibility?" The doctor hesitated. "A remote one, perhaps. I'll not swear to poison without proof, but I cannot dismiss it either." Leaving the surgery, Purbright walked back toward the market square. His inquiries had yielded little in the way of solid evidence, yet he sensed currents beneath the surface: unease, secrecy, perhaps fear. People were guarding something, though whether it was guilt or simply reputation remained to be seen. As he passed the baker's shop, Constable Sims hurried up with a scrap of information. "Sir, about that letter Mr. Penbury was said to have sent. We've traced it to the post office ledger. It was never collected." "Could have been intercepted." Perbrite nodded slowly. "Another small step, Constable. Sometimes a missing letter can speak as loudly as a signed confession." He looked back toward the Penbury house, its curtains drawn against the curious world. Somewhere within that house, and within the polite conversations he had held that morning, lay the first clear sign of motive. All that was required was patience, and listening for the moment when courtesy slipped, revealing the truth beneath. The morning after his round of interviews, Inspector Perbrite returned to the station to find Sergeant Love standing by the incident board, staring at a list of banquet guests with the troubled concentration of a man grappling with a puzzle in which several pieces seemed to be missing. "Good morning, Sergeant," Perbrite said mildly as he removed his coat and hat.
"You appear to be deep in thought." Love turned, his face earnest.
"It's this seating chart, sir. We've matched nearly every place card to a guest except one. Everyone claims to have seen only familiar faces, but there's still this empty slot." Perbrite examined the board, tapping one finger thoughtfully against the unmarked space.
"Curious," he murmured.
"One absent guest whose name no one seems able, or willing, to recall."
"That, Sergeant, suggests either a very forgettable individual or a very inconvenient truth." Love's brow furrowed. "Couldn't it just be that someone moved the card by mistake?"
"It could," Perbrite allowed, "though mistakes in Flaxborough tend to have consequences far out of proportion to their size. Let us not dismiss it just yet." Before Love could reply, Constable Sims entered, carrying a slim envelope. "Post office sent this over, sir. It's the ledger record of outgoing private correspondence from the afternoon before the banquet." Perbrite accepted it and glanced through the neat columns of entries. One in particular caught his eye, a letter listed under Lawrence Penbury's account, marked urgent.
No recipient was noted. "Sergeant," Perbrite said, "make a note of this."
A missing guest, a missing name, and now a missing letter. Patterns often announce themselves softly at first. Leaving the station, he set out to call upon a man whose name had surfaced repeatedly in his conversations. Though always indirectly, Mr. Julian Kettering, a solicitor of impeccable manners and curiously limited reputation. Kettering's office, situated above a tailor's shop, was reached by a narrow stairway that smelled faintly of chalk and old cloth. Kettering himself was a tall,
angular man with a perpetually courteous smile.
He rose as Perbrite entered, bowing slightly as though greeting a visiting dignitary rather than a police inspector. "Inspector Perbrite, what an unexpected honour," he said smoothly. "Do sit down."
"Tea? Coffee?"
"Tea, if it's no trouble," Perbrite replied, taking a seat opposite the polished desk. As Kettering busied himself with a tray, Perbrite observed the office. Everything was precise, from the neatly stacked documents to the gleaming brass pen holder. There was, however, an odd absence of personal effects, No photographs, no idle clutter. A space carefully curated to reveal nothing. Once settled, Perbrite began with the kind of questions that appeared harmless. "You attended the banquet, I believe?" "I did indeed."
A splendid occasion, though marred, of course, by the dreadful tragedy. Tragedy, Purbright echoed softly.
"Would you describe your acquaintance with Mr. Penbury as close?" Kettering's smile held, though a fraction more rigidly. "Professional rather than personal. I handled certain legal matters for him, contracts, leases, that sort of thing. Nothing out of the ordinary." Perbrite sipped his tea, letting the silence stretch until Kettering felt compelled to fill it. "Mr. Penbury was a man of ambition," the solicitor added carefully. "He occasionally moved in circles where ambition might clash with others. But such is the nature of business, wouldn't you say?" "Indeed," Perbrite murmured. "Did he ever mention, perhaps in passing, that he felt threatened?" Kettering gave a light laugh, entirely without warmth. "Threatened?"
No, nothing of the sort."
Lawrence was not the type to be intimidated. Quite the reverse, in fact. As the conversation continued, Perbrite noted how Kettering deflected certain questions with elegant vagueness. When asked about the missing letter, the solicitor professed complete ignorance, though he seemed a fraction too quick in his denial. When Perbrite finally rose to leave, he paused at the door. "One final matter, Mr. Kettering. Did you notice anyone unfamiliar at the banquet? Perhaps seated near you?" Kettering hesitated for the briefest moment. A pause, so slight most would have missed it. "No, Inspector," he said smoothly. "Everyone present was perfectly well known to me." The inspector thanked him and departed, his expression unreadable. Outside he paused on the pavement and considered the exchange. Kettering had been all courtesy and charm, yet beneath the polished surface there had been something guarded, almost brittle. Later that afternoon, Perbrite stopped at the Sailor's Rest, where Jack Roper and his circle of drinking companions were once again dissecting the case. At the inspector's appearance, their voices dropped, though not entirely to silence. "Evening, sir," Roper said, standing with a nod. "We were just saying, it's a queer business."
A gentleman drops dead in front of half the town and nobody sees a thing. Curious, isn't it?
Perbrite agreed pleasantly. "Tell me, Mr. Roper, did you notice anyone you didn't recognize that night?" The men exchanged glances. Finally, one spoke up. "There was a chap near the back, quiet-like. Didn't say much. Wore a grey suit, I think." Perbrite's gaze sharpened. "Would you say he was sitting alone?"
"Aye," the man said slowly.
"Seemed to be keeping to himself." "Thank you," Perbrite said, his tone mild. "You've been most helpful." When he left the pub, dusk was settling over the town and the street lamps were just beginning to glow. As he walked, Perbrite reflected on the pattern emerging. A solitary figure unacknowledged by the official guest list, a solicitor too careful in his denials, a missing letter that might contain the key to motive. Back at the station, he found Sergeant Love poring over maps of seating arrangements. "Anything new, sir?" Love asked, hopefully. "Only the confirmation," Perbrite said quietly, "that our missing guest was not merely a matter of misplaced stationery. Someone was present who should not have been, and at least one other person is very anxious that we do not discover who." He stood before the board, gazing at the blank space where the unclaimed place card had been marked. "The first, gentleman sergeant," he said softly. "The first of several, I suspect." The following morning dawned grey and mist-laden, the kind of weather that dulled colours and made the streets of Flaxborough appear slightly unreal, as though the town itself were holding its breath. Inspector Perbrite, whose calm disposition rarely altered with the weather, was already at his desk when Sergeant Love arrived, looking damp and disgruntled, not a soul about. "Sir," Love reported, rubbing his hands. "You'd think the whole place had gone into hiding." "Perhaps," Perbrite said, glancing up from a document. "They are merely conserving their energy for the day's gossip." He pushed the paper aside and regarded the sergeant.
"Any word on the man in the grey suit?" Love shook his head.
"None, sir. Nobody admits to knowing him, and none of the serving staff remembers seeing him clearly."
"It's as if he vanished the moment Mr. Penbury fell." people, Purbright murmured, do have a remarkable capacity for selective memory, especially when it is convenient to forget. He rose, taking his coat.
Come, Sergeant. Today we shall trouble a few memories and perhaps jog a few consciences. Their first call was at the home of Mrs. Amelia Venn, a genteel widow whose sharp eyes and sharper tongue made her an unofficial chronicler of local society. Mrs. Venn received them with elaborate graciousness,
Ushering them into a parlour overflowing with knickknacks and photographs of long-dead relatives. Such a dreadful business.
"Inspector," she said, lowering herself into a chair with a dramatic sigh. I was present, of course, though at a distance from the poor man when it happened.
I can hardly bring myself to think of it without shuddering. Purbright offered sympathetic noises while subtly steering the conversation.
"Mrs. Venn, you are known for your excellent powers of observation. Did you happen to notice anyone unusual among the guests that evening?" Her eyes gleamed with the pleasure of being consulted. "Why, yes, now that you mention it. There was a gentleman near the back, quite solitary. I assumed he was one of those quiet types who slip through life unnoticed. Grey suit, I believe. Did you see with whom he spoke?" "No one at all, Inspector. He seemed quite self-contained." Perbrite thanked her and rose to leave. As he reached the door, Mrs. Venn leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Between ourselves, there are those who say Mr. Penbury was not the man everyone thought, that he entertained certain attachments that were not entirely proper." She gave a meaningful look. "I have no wish to speak ill of the dead, but propriety must be preserved." Outside, Love muttered, "She'd speak ill of the living too if it got her a free cup of tea." Perbrite gave a mild smile. "All information has value, Sergeant, even malice." Their next visit took them to the offices of a local shipping firm, where Perbrite had arranged to meet a junior clerk who had handled some of Penbury's business transactions. The young man was nervous, his hands fumbling with papers. "I shouldn't be talking to you at all," he said anxiously. "Mr. Kettering, that's Mr. Penbury's solicitor, said we were to keep everything strictly confidential." "Quite right," Perbrite agreed soothingly. "Confidentiality is essential, which is why you are speaking only to me and only to ensure the truth is fully understood." Under this gentle pressure, the clerk admitted that Penbury had been involved in a deal concerning a parcel of riverside land. The sale had been hurried, the buyer's identity carefully concealed through intermediaries. Mr. Penbury seemed
"Uneasy," the clerk said, lowering his voice.
Almost as if he was afraid someone might find out who was really behind it. As they left, Love whispered, "Could Kettering be hiding something, sir?" "Almost certainly," Perbrite replied. "The question is whether he hides it for himself or for another." By midday they returned to the station, where Constable Sims was waiting with an object wrapped in brown paper. "Found this during a sweep near the Borough Hall, sir."
Lodged behind a drain pipe, Purbright unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small leather wallet.
Its contents were surprisingly meagre: a few coins, a railway ticket stub, and a folded piece of paper. The paper, when opened, revealed a hastily scrawled note. "Tuesday,
11 o'clock.
Come alone." The inspector examined it without comment, though his eyes sharpened. He replaced the items and instructed Sims to keep the find confidential. "Could belong to our mystery guest," Love suggested. "Or to someone who wished us to think so," Perbrite said softly. That afternoon, Perbrite made a discreet call on the postmaster. After much polite manoeuvring, he learned that the missing letter from Penbury's account had been handled personally by Mr. Kettering. "Kettering?" Love said in astonishment as they left. "Why would he collect it?" "Perhaps," Perbrite mused, "because its contents were more dangerous than its delivery." As evening fell, Perbrite returned alone to the market square. The mist had thickened, muffling sounds and blurring shapes. He walked slowly, turning over the day's discoveries in his mind.
A solitary stranger at the banquet, a solicitor with too many secrets.
A hurried land deal, a vanished letter, and now a mysterious meeting hinted at, in a pocketed note. He stopped beneath a street lamp, watching the pale light ripple across the cobblestones. Each clue seemed insignificant on its own, yet together they formed the outline of a design he could almost see. Somewhere in the pattern lay the key to Penbury's death. Behind him, a window creaked open, and a voice drifted into the fog, low, urgent, and quickly silenced. Perbrite turned, but the window had already been closed. As he walked back to the station, his thoughts were steady, deliberate. The town was holding its secrets tightly, like coins clenched in a desperate fist. Sooner or later, though, someone would loosen their grip. And when they did, he intended to be there to catch whatever fell. The fog lingered well into the next morning, clinging to rooftops and curling around the lampposts like smoke from an unseen fire. By mid-morning, Flaxborough had taken on a ghostly air, its streets quiet but for the occasional clatter of a milk cart or the hollow echo of footsteps. Inspector Perbrite found the weather suited the mood of the investigation, for the case itself seemed cloaked in a similar obscurity. Hints and shapes glimpsed, but never fully revealed. At the station, Sergeant Love greeted him with an air of barely contained agitation. "Sir," he said, thrusting a slip of paper forward, "we've had word from Mrs. Penbury's housekeeper. Apparently the lady received an anonymous note this morning."
No signature, no sender. Purbright took the paper and read the message.
It consisted of only 5 words, hastily scrawled, "You are not safe. Leave." There was no envelope, no trace of where it had been posted.
"Curious," he murmured.
Warnings are a rare courtesy in such matters, and rarer still when delivered anonymously. Could it be a hoax?
Love suggested. Possibly.
Or it may be that someone wishes to frighten Mrs. Penbury away from something, or someone. He folded the note neatly and slipped it into his pocket. "We shall pay her a visit this afternoon. For now, I would like you to recheck the list of banquet guests. Look for anyone who might have reason to obscure their presence." As Love nodded and began his task, a sharp rap sounded on the station door. Constable Sims entered, visibly shaken. "So there's been, well, another incident," he said breathlessly. Perbrite rose at once. "Where?" "Down by the old riverside warehouse, sir. Mr. Kettering was found there not half an hour ago, unconscious, bleeding from a nasty cut on the head." Within minutes, Perbrite and Love were following Sims through the mist-shrouded streets. The warehouse loomed ahead like a dark, hunched figure at the edge of the river. A small crowd had gathered despite the early hour, whispering in anxious tones that fell silent as the inspector approached. Inside, Kettering lay on a makeshift cot attended by Dr. Hilliard, who looked harassed and impatient. The solicitor's usually immaculate appearance was in disarray, coat torn, shirt collar askew, and his hair matted with blood. "He'll live," Hilliard said curtly. "Blow to the head, but no fracture. Likely concussed." Perbrite crouched beside the injured man. "Mr. Kettering, can you hear me?" Kettering groaned softly, his eyelids fluttering.
At last he managed to whisper, "Someone
"Attacked me."
from behind." "Didn't see who? Why were you here at this hour?"
Perbrite asked gently. The solicitor hesitated, his breath ragged.
"Came to meet someone. A message was left for me."
Said it concerned Penbury. His eyes rolled back, and he slipped into unconsciousness again. Perbrite stood, his expression unreadable. "A meeting arranged by message," he said quietly. "And now an attack. That suggests either an ambush or a silencing." Love frowned. Could it be the same person who left that note for Mrs. Penbury? Perhaps. Though the note she received urged departure, not danger. 2 very different intentions. They examined the warehouse. It was largely empty, save for a scattering of broken crates and a lingering smell of damp wood. Near the doorway, Perbrite found a single object half hidden beneath debris. A leather glove, dark with moisture. He lifted it delicately. "Left-hand glove," he observed. "Well made, expensive, not the sort one associates with dock labourers." Back at the station, Kettering was placed under watch while Dr. Hilliard tended him. Perbrite and Love reviewed their growing list of peculiarities. "We now have 2 attacks possibly linked," Love said, ticking points off on his fingers. "First Mr. Penbury at the banquet, then Mr. Kettering here, and still no sign of that grey-suited stranger." "2 attacks, yes," Perbrite said, pacing slowly, "but of differing kinds.
One final, the other merely wounding.
That distinction may be significant." Love looked puzzled. "Significant how, sir?" Perbrite paused, gazing at the glove. "One man removed permanently, the other kept alive, perhaps to be questioned, perhaps to be framed, or perhaps simply because the attacker was interrupted. That afternoon they visited Mrs. Penbury as planned. She received them in the same darkened parlour, though her composure seemed slightly frayed. The anonymous note lay upon a side table, its presence like a silent intruder. "You see, Inspector," she said dramatically, "someone wishes me ill. First my husband murdered, now this dreadful threat."
"Surely you must do something." Perbrite inclined his head.
"We're doing all we can, madam. Might I inquire whether your husband ever mentioned a Mr. Kettering?" Her reaction was subtle, but to Perbrite's practised eye, unmistakable. A slight tightening around the mouth, a pause before speaking. "Yes," she said slowly. "He handled certain affairs for my husband."
"Legal matters."
"But why do you ask?" "Kettering was attacked this morning," Perbrite said evenly. "We are investigating whether there is a connection between his assault and your husband's death." Mrs. Penbury's hand flew to her throat.
"Oh, good heavens!"
"Then it must be the same villain at work." "Oh, Inspector, you must protect me," Perbrite offered polite assurances, but left with more questions than answers. As they walked back toward the station, Love muttered, "She's quick to make herself the centre of everything, sir." "Indeed," Perbrite agreed. "Sometimes the loudest cries for help are meant to distract from something else entirely." That evening, as darkness fell and the mist thickened once more, a message arrived at the station. It had been slipped under the door without anyone seeing who delivered it. The note was brief and written in a different hand from the one Mrs. Penbury had received. "The first is done. The second failed. The next will not." Love read it aloud, his face pale.
"Sir, this sounds like a promise of another attack." Perbrite nodded slowly, his gaze steady.
"Or a warning to us. Either way, Sergeant, it seems we are no longer dealing merely with whispers and rumours. Someone has moved beyond words and intends to act again." As he spoke, the faint tolling of the church bell drifted through the fog, carrying with it a grim sense of inevitability. Somewhere in Flaxborough, plans were already being laid for the next move, and Perbrite knew he had little time left to untangle the web before another thread was cut. Inspector Perbrite remained at his desk long after the others had gone, the lamplight casting a pool of gold upon the scattered papers. Outside, the fog muffled the usual evening sounds of Flaxborough, leaving the station wrapped in a stillness that seemed to deepen his thoughts. He sat with his hands loosely clasped, gazing at the cryptic note delivered that evening. "The first is done. The second failed. The next will not." The words had an unsettling precision. They implied planning, forethought, even a kind of grim accounting. Whoever had written them was not driven by passion alone. There was method here and purpose. Perbrite had long known that murder rarely sprang from chaos. More often it emerged quietly, like mould creeping beneath wallpaper, fed by grievances that had been cultivated in silence. He considered the pattern so far. Lawrence Penbury dead at the banquet before the eyes of half the town. Julian Kettering attacked in a deserted warehouse, struck down but not killed. And Mrs. Penbury, the widow whose composure had seemed rehearsed even in grief, now the recipient of a threatening message. 3 events connected by threads that remained stubbornly tangled. Perbrite rose and paced the small office, his steps measured. He thought of Kettering's guarded replies during their interview, his careful vagueness when asked about Penbury's affairs. A man like that did not risk attending a clandestine meeting unless he was compelled by something weighty, perhaps fear, perhaps greed. And yet why choose a warehouse at dawn, unless the location itself had meaning? He paused by the window, looking out at the faint glow of the gas lamps through the mist. The river lay somewhere beyond, invisible but always present like an unspoken truth. The riverside land deal mentioned by the nervous clerk came back to him. It had been hurried, concealed behind layers of legal subterfuge, and now both Penbury and Kettering were linked to violence. Could that deal be the heart of the matter? Turning back to his desk, Purbright examined the recovered wallet once more. The note inside, Tuesday, 11 o'clock, come alone, seemed straightforward, yet its very simplicity was suspicious. Such words could summon a man to a meeting or lure him to his ruin. Was it truly written by the same hand that had struck Kettering, or by someone wishing to frame another? Love, earlier in the evening, had suggested that perhaps the same villain had tried and failed to kill Kettering. Perbrite was not so sure. The blow had been forceful enough to wound, yet strangely imprecise. It lacked the finality of Penbury's death, which had been executed with cold efficiency. Two attacks, two very different styles. Could there be more than one hand at work?
Or was the difference intentional, meant to mislead?
He sat once more, folding his hands beneath his chin. Mrs. Penbury's performance of grief had been near flawless, yet too polished, like a speech learned by rote. She had spoken often of enemies, always unnamed, always vague, while carefully avoiding mention of her own dealings. It was possible she was merely a woman protecting her reputation in a town that thrived on gossip. But it was equally possible she was playing a deeper game, one in which appearances mattered more than truth. The inspector's gaze moved to the missing place card. The absence of that single name gnawed at him more than any overt clue. It represented someone invisible, someone who had moved among the crowd unseen and unacknowledged. Such invisibility required either extraordinary skill or willing blindness on the part of others. And in Flaxborough, where politeness often served as a shield, it was entirely plausible that a man could be overlooked simply because no one wished to look too closely. Perbrite allowed his thoughts to drift further back, to the first moments after Penbury's collapse. He recalled the overturned wine glass, the precise timing of events. Poison seemed likely, yet Dr. Hilliard's hesitations had been telling. If poison had been used, it was a substance unfamiliar to even a practiced physician, or one disguised by something commonplace. The banquet itself offered many opportunities. A glass exchanged, a dish passed hand to hand. In a crowded hall, murder could be served as easily as dessert. He thought, too, of the messages. One warning Mrs. Penbury to leave, the other boasting of failure and future intent. The contrast between them was stark. One voice sought to protect, the other to threaten. Unless, of course, both came from the same person, sowing confusion deliberately. In Flaxborough, deception was rarely straightforward. Lies were layered like paint, each coat concealing the one beneath. Perbrite sat very still, listening to the faint ticking of the station clock. His mind sifted through the human elements of the case: ambition, envy, fear. Penbury had been ambitious, perhaps too much so. Kettering had been secretive, his loyalty uncertain. Mrs. Penbury, outwardly fragile, might possess a strength hidden beneath her widow's weeds. And the townspeople themselves, eager to gossip, reluctant to accuse, formed a background chorus that distorted every note of truth. He considered the possibility that the attacks were not merely connected by motive, but by design. If someone wished to manipulate the narrative, what better way than to create a pattern that led investigators astray? A death in public view, an assault in private, a threat delivered anonymously, each step escalating tension, each carefully timed to keep fear alive. A soft knock interrupted his reverie. Constable Sims entered, cap in hand. "Beg pardon, sir, but there's been no sign of movement near the warehouse since we posted the watch."
"All quiet. Thank you, Sims," Perbrite said, his voice calm.
"Remain vigilant. Quiet often precedes activity. When Sims had gone, Purbright returned to his chair. He allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, not on evidence but on human nature. In Flaxborough, he had learned, murder was seldom committed by strangers lurking in dark alleys. More often it arose within the very circles that prided themselves on civility. A polite smile could hide a festering grudge, just as a perfectly set table could conceal a poisoned dish. He extinguished the lamp and stood in the dim light of dawn creeping through the window. The case was far from solved, yet he felt the shape of it forming like a silhouette behind a curtain. There were still too many questions, too many secrets clutched tightly in closed fists. But the web was tightening. Soon, someone would make a mistake, a glance too sharp, a word too carefully chosen. And when that moment came, Perbrite intended to be ready as he left the station. The mist began to thin, revealing the familiar outlines of the town. To anyone else, Flaxborough might have looked peaceful. To Perbrite, it looked like a stage set for the next act. And somewhere behind those curtained windows, the players were rehearsing their lines. By the next morning, the mist had finally lifted, though the town seemed no brighter for it. The pale sunlight only revealed the strain etched on Flaxborough's faces, the hushed conversations at street corners, and the nervous glances exchanged as people hurried about their business. Fear was like a scent in the air, faint but unmistakable. Inspector Perbrite arrived at the station early, his expression composed yet purposeful. He had spent much of the previous night turning over possibilities, shaping theories, and discarding them as new thoughts arose. There were too many moving parts, too many voices whispering contradictory stories. If he was to pierce the fog of lies, he needed clarity, and more importantly, he needed to provoke a reaction. "Sergeant Love," he said as his subordinate entered, "today we shall try a slightly different approach. Information, as you've noticed, is being carefully rationed by those who hold it. We must create a situation in which certain tongues loosen of their own accord." Love, who knew from experience that this usually meant trouble, looked uneasy. "What do you have in mind, sir?" "A small gathering," Perbrite replied, his tone almost cheerful. "An informal meeting at the Borough Hall this evening. We shall invite those most closely connected to Mr. Penbury, including Mrs. Penbury herself, Mr. Kettering, and a few others. Nothing official, merely a civilized conversation over tea and biscuits," Love blinked. "A tea party, sir?" "Precisely," Perbrite said, eyes glinting. "But one at which we shall carefully observe what is said, and even more carefully note what is not." Arrangements were made throughout the day with the utmost delicacy. Invitations were delivered with polite explanations that the inspector merely wished to clarify certain details in a comfortable setting. None of the invitees refused, though some hesitated long enough to reveal reluctance. By evening, the Borough Hall's smaller meeting room had been prepared. A long table was laid with china cups, a plate of currant buns, and a pot of strong tea. The setting was deliberately unthreatening, almost domestic, though a uniformed constable stood discreetly by the door. The guests arrived one by one, Mrs. Penbury in deep mourning, her veil slightly askew to suggest recent tears. Julian Kettering, pale and unsteady after his injury, but determined to maintain dignity. Alderman Carter, perspiring freely and clearly, wishing himself elsewhere. And Mrs. Venn, invited as a witness, but already relishing the role of amateur detective. Perbrite greeted each with unfailing courtesy, ushering them to their seats and making genial small talk until everyone was settled. Then he rose, teacup in hand, and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am most grateful for your attendance. Our purpose this evening is simply to review the events surrounding Mr. Penbury's untimely death and subsequent occurrences. Nothing formal, nothing accusatory, merely a mutual exchange of recollections," Mrs. Venn tittered nervously. Mrs. Penbury inclined her head with a regal air. Kettering's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his face unreadable. Perbrite began with innocuous questions. who had arrived first at the banquet, who had spoken with Penbury during the early courses, who had noticed anything unusual about the seating arrangements. The answers came readily at first, everyone eager to appear cooperative. But as the questions grew more precise, unease crept in. When asked about the missing place card, Alderman Carter shifted uncomfortably.
I can't recall, Inspector.
These events are a blur, you know. One can hardly be expected to remember every detail, indeed, Perbrite said smoothly. Yet small details often prove surprisingly significant. For instance, Mr. Kettering, you were seated near the back. Did you observe the gentleman who occupied that particular seat? Kettering's mouth tightened. I
may have seen someone there, yes.
But I could not say who. It was rather crowded. Quite so, Purbright murmured, as though satisfied. In truth, he was watching the room, not the words. Mrs. Penbury's hands had stilled upon her lap at Kettering's reply, her knuckles whitening beneath their black gloves. He allowed the conversation to meander for a time, then casually introduced the matter of the riverfront land deal. It appears Mr. Penbury was involved in certain transactions shortly before his death. Perhaps some of you are familiar with them? There was a collective stillness. Carter coughed loudly. Mrs. Venn, sensing drama, leaned forward. Mrs. Penbury's lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. Kettering cleared his throat. As Mr. Penbury's solicitor, I must stress that such dealings are confidential. To speculate publicly would be most improper. Of course, Perbrite said agreeably. Confidentiality is the cornerstone of trust. Still, it is curious that shortly after those dealings concluded, Mr. Penbury should meet with such an unfortunate fate. Curious, too, that certain records appear to have been removed from his files. Kettering's composure faltered. Removed?
I know nothing of that. Ah, Purbright sipped his tea, his expression bland. Perhaps they were misplaced. It happens! The tension in the room thickened.
Perbrite let it stretch, then placed his cup carefully on the table. His voice, when he spoke again, was almost conversational. There is one final matter. A letter Mr. Penbury wrote the day before his death. It never reached its destination.
In fact, we have reason to believe it was intercepted. He glanced around the table, his gaze resting briefly on each face.
It may interest you all to know that I have seen the contents of this letter. This was a deliberate falsehood, but the effect was immediate. Carter looked baffled, Mrs. Venn thrilled, Kettering visibly alarmed. Most telling of all was Mrs. Penbury, who gave a small, involuntary gasp before pressing her handkerchief to her lips. Perbrite continued smoothly. The letter names an individual who Mr. Penbury believed posed a danger to him.
I shall not reveal the name, not yet.
But I will say this, the danger has not passed. And unless the truth is spoken tonight, another incident may soon occur. Silence fell, heavy and expectant. Then, like a crack in thin ice, Mrs. Venn blurted, "Well, I for one think it must be that mysterious stranger. The one in the grey suit." The release of tension was almost visible. Carter seized upon the suggestion eagerly. Yes, a stranger, of course. Some outsider come to do mischief. Kettering said nothing. His eyes fixed on the table. Mrs. Penbury, however, gave a sharp,
derisive laugh at a sound utterly out of character for a grieving widow. Stranger?
She said bitterly. Flaxborough does not need strangers to breed malice. Everything we require is right here among us. The room went still again. Perbrite, inwardly satisfied, inclined his head. A profound observation, madam, and perhaps the most truthful statement we have heard this evening. He let the silence linger a moment longer, then smiled politely and announced that the meeting was concluded. The guests departed with visible relief, though each carried away a heightened sense of unease. When the last footsteps faded, Love turned to his superior. "Well, sir, did we learn anything?" Perbrite picked up his untouched currant bun and regarded it thoughtfully.
"Oh, yes, Sergeant.
We learned precisely who fears the truth most, and who is prepared to lie with the greatest conviction. That, in itself, is invaluable." As they left the hall, Perbrite allowed himself a private thought. The trap had been set, and the first tremor of its spring had been felt. Now he need only wait for the guilty to stumble. The following evening, as dusk settled over Flaxborough and the lamps glowed like watchful eyes, Inspector Purbright made his way to the Penbury residence. The house, with its darkened windows and heavy drapes, seemed to brood over the narrow street. A uniformed constable stood discreetly outside, nodding as Perbrite entered. Inside, the drawing-room had been arranged much as it had on the night of their first meeting. A fire crackled low in the grate, casting wavering shadows on the ornate wallpaper. Mrs. Penbury sat near the hearth, her posture as composed as a portrait, though her face showed signs of strain beneath the veil. Across from her sat Julian Kettering, pale and tense, while Alderman Carter hovered near the sideboard, pretending to examine the decanter of sherry. Mrs. Venn, clutching her handbag like a shield, occupied a chair in the corner, her eyes wide with anticipation. Perbrite entered with his customary courtesy.
"Thank you all for coming," he said pleasantly.
"I realize the past days have been trying, but I believe we are now in a position to bring clarity to this unhappy affair." No one spoke. Only the muted crackle of the fire and the distant clop of hooves outside broke the silence. Perbrite remained standing, his hands loosely clasped. "We began," he said evenly, "with a sudden death at the Borough Hall, Mr. Penbury apparently struck down by illness. Yet certain details soon suggested otherwise: the position of his glass, the expressions of those nearby, and, most tellingly, the speed with which certain individuals moved to control the narrative." Mrs. Penbury's veil trembled slightly. Carter shifted uneasily, his cheeks glistening. "From the beginning," Perbrite continued, "rumours swirled. A mysterious stranger, a quarrel over business, a letter naming an unnamed threat. Most of these, I am now satisfied, were deliberate distractions. The truth was simpler, and therefore easier to overlook." He turned his gaze on Kettering, whose hands gripped his knees. "Mr. Kettering, you were entrusted with Mr. Penbury's legal affairs, including a hasty transaction involving riverside land. That transaction concealed the identity of a buyer whose interests conflicted sharply with Mr. Penbury's own. When Penbury discovered this deception, he prepared to expose it. The letter he wrote that day named the party responsible." Kettering swallowed, his eyes darting toward Mrs. Penbury, then away. "Inspector, Perbrite raised a hand, silencing him with gentle authority. "You were not the instigator, Mr. Kettering, merely the instrument. The true architect sat much closer to Mr. Penbury, in fact, across his very table." The room seemed to contract as all eyes turned toward Mrs. Penbury. She did not flinch, but her voice, when it came, was cool and precise. "You are accusing me of my husband's death, Inspector?" Perbrite inclined his head slightly. "I am describing a sequence of events, madam. Your husband's ambitions threatened to expose financial misdeeds that would have ruined you. Divorce was unthinkable, disgrace intolerable. Poison offered a cleaner solution, and a public setting ensured sympathy. Afterward, you would appear the wronged widow while retaining control of the estate." Mrs. Venn gasped audibly. Carter muttered something incoherent and backed toward the wall. "The missing place card," Perbrite went on calmly, "belonged to no mysterious stranger at all. It was a convenient fiction. You ensured a seat was left unclaimed so that blame might be shifted to an imaginary guest. Several witnesses, however, recall you lingering near the high table before the banquet began, precisely where Mr. Penbury's glass was placed." Mrs. Penbury rose slowly, her hands clenched at her sides.
"And the attack on Mr. Kettering?"
she demanded. "Was that my doing as well?" "No," Perbrite said. "That was his attempt to protect himself. Mr. Kettering realized, too late, that he had become dangerous to you simply by knowing too much. You arranged for him to meet in secret, intending to silence him permanently."
"But something, perhaps his own caution, disrupted the plan, leaving him wounded rather than dead. Kettering, buried his face in his hands. "I should have come to you sooner," he whispered. Purbright's voice softened.
"Fear makes cowards of many men, Mr. Kettering, but courage often comes too late." Mrs. Penbury stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable beneath the veil. At last she gave a low, bitter laugh. "You speak of courage, Inspector, as if truth were ever rewarded in this town. My husband was a tyrant. He controlled everything. My money, my reputation, even my movements."
"Yes, I killed him."
"But you think anyone will thank me for freeing them from his grasp? They will whisper, they will condemn, and they will go on with their small, poisonous lives." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Perbrite regarded her with quiet gravity. "Justice, madam, is seldom about thanks. It is about balance. Tonight, the balance is restored." He nodded to the constable by the door. The man stepped forward, placing a firm but respectful hand on Mrs. Penbury's arm. She did not resist as she was led away, her head held high like a queen in exile. When the door closed behind her, silence returned. Mrs. Venn began to sob softly into her handkerchief. Carter poured himself a large glass of sherry with shaking hands. Perbrite turned to Love, who had been standing quietly throughout. "See to the necessary arrangements, Sergeant. There is paperwork to be done." As they departed, Perbrite cast one last glance at the now empty chair by the fire. In the flickering light, it seemed to hold the shape of all that had passed: ambition, deceit, and the brittle veneer of respectability. The following morning dawned pale and brittle, as though the night's revelations had leached some colour from the world. A thin frost coated the rooftops, glittering faintly in the early light. Flaxborough stirred itself slowly, with the hesitant motions of a town unsure whether to resume its familiar routines or pause to savour the scandal that now hung in the air like lingering smoke. In the market square, stallholders set up their wares with unusual quiet. Conversation was subdued, conducted in low voices and cautious glances. The news of Mrs. Penbury's arrest had spread with breathtaking speed, yet even the most enthusiastic gossip spoke of it with an odd restraint. It was one thing to speculate about wrongdoing, quite another to have it confirmed so starkly. Mrs. Venn, bundled in her winter shawl, recounted the events of the previous evening to a small knot of listeners outside the baker's. She relished her role as witness, though her account grew increasingly dramatic with each retelling. By the third version, she had personally detected the poison, uncovered the missing place card, and bravely confronted Mrs. Penbury before fainting into a convenient chair. The listeners murmured appropriately, though their eyes strayed toward the corner where Inspector Purbright was passing by, his calm stride a quiet counterpoint to her fevered embellishments. Inside the police station, Sergeant Love was already at his desk, shuffling through reports. He looked up as Perbrite entered, relief evident on his face. "Morning, sir. It's been peaceful, all things considered."
"No disturbances, just plenty of talk." "Talk seldom disturbs, Sergeant," Perbrite replied mildly, hanging his coat on its accustomed peg.
"It is action we must watch for." He settled at his desk and reviewed the previous night's statements. Kettering's deposition had been lengthy but illuminating. Fear had loosened his tongue at last, and he had described in halting detail the chain of events leading to Penbury's death. His own role was that of reluctant accomplice, drawn into Mrs. Penbury's schemes by a mixture of professional obligation and personal weakness. Perbrite had listened without outward judgment, though inwardly he reflected that few crimes were committed by monsters alone. Most required the quiet cooperation of ordinary men. Love brought over a cup of tea, setting it down with unusual care. "So do you think Mrs. Penbury planned it all from the start? The banquet, the poison, even that nonsense about a stranger no one saw?" Perbrite sipped his tea before answering. She planned what she believed necessary. The fiction of a mysterious guest served her purpose well. It gave the town something to chase, while the truth sat comfortably by their firesides. In the end, though, her greatest error was believing she could control every detail. Human nature, Sergeant, is far less tidy than a seating plan, Love nodded slowly, though it was clear the philosophical turn of the remark escaped him. And the estate, sir? What happens now? That will be for the solicitors to unravel, Purbright said. No doubt Mr. Kettering will find himself very busy indeed. Perhaps the experience will teach him the value of simpler dealings. They worked in companionable silence for a time. Outside, the usual sounds of town life began to return. The clatter of hoofbeats, the creak of cartwheels, the distant shouts of children released from lessons. The ordinary world, indifferent to tragedy, was reasserting itself. Later in the morning, Alderman Carter arrived at the station, red-faced and perspiring, despite the chill. He expressed, with many flourishes, his gratitude for the inspector's handling of the case and his hope that the matter could now be considered closed. The town must move forward, Carter declared. There's no benefit in dwelling on unpleasantness. Perbrite listened politely, offering non-committal replies until the alderman departed, somewhat deflated by the inspector's lack of enthusiasm for civic speeches. When they were alone again, Love remarked, "Funny thing, sir. People seem almost disappointed it's over."
As though they'll miss the excitement. Purbright allowed himself a small smile.
Scandal, Sergeant, is a form of entertainment. It offers drama without requiring the audience to act. But when the curtain falls, they return to their own small performances. Quieter, perhaps, but no less elaborate. By afternoon, the Penbury house had been sealed, its shutters closed. Neighbours passed by with studied indifference, pretending not to stare. The very space that had once projected wealth and power now seemed hollow, a monument to ambition undone. As evening approached, Perbrite walked alone through the market square. The frost had melted, leaving the cobblestones damp and gleaming. Shop windows glowed warmly, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery. To an outsider, Flaxborough might have appeared serene, untouched by the turbulence of recent days. But Perbrite, with his practiced eye, saw the subtle signs, averted gazes, hurried steps, conversations broken off mid-sentence. The town had been altered, if only slightly. He paused at the corner where Mrs. Venn now held court once again, spinning her tales with tireless energy. As he listened briefly, he noted how her narrative had shifted yet again. Now she was the heroine who had bravely suspected the truth all along. The others nodded, half believing, half enjoying the story for its own sake. In time, the details would blur, and the reality of Penbury's death would become just another tale told over tea. Returning to the station, Perbrite found Love tidying his desk. "Quiet evening ahead, sir," Love said hopefully. "One can only hope," Perbrite replied. He sat down, opened a ledger, and began to write with steady precision. The day's events, stripped of drama and sentiment, would be reduced to neat lines of ink, evidence filed, statements recorded, conclusions reached. As the light faded and the town settled into its nightly rhythms, Perbrite reflected that justice was rarely dramatic. It was a process, often slow and unspectacular, like the turning of seasons. The players changed, the stories varied, but the underlying patterns remained. When the final entry was made, he closed the ledger and leaned back, listening to the quiet. Outside, the first stars appeared, cold and distant above the rooftops. Somewhere, beyond the reach of law or gossip, life went on. In the end, that was Flaxborough, a place of secrets and silences, where truth was seldom shouted but always present, waiting patiently to be uncovered. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.